The sky over the Pacific that morning looked calm, almost innocent. A soft blue stretched endlessly above the ocean. The kind of sky that tricks young men into believing war has rules, mercy and warning signs. Inside the aluminum body of the B-29 Superfortress, no one trusted that calm. They had flown too many missions to be fooled by silence. Engines roared with a steady, bone-deep vibration. 4 massive propellers cutting the air as the bomber moved closer to Japan. This was not just another bombing run. This was the kind of mission where statistics stopped mattering, where survival depended on instinct, discipline, and sometimes sheer madness. The B-29 was the pride of American air power. Pressurized cabin, long-range, heavy defensive guns, but pride did not stop bullets. The crew knew the rumors. Japanese pilots were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to die well. Ramming attacks were becoming common, fighters deliberately smashing into bombers like human missiles. Everyone aboard had heard the stories. Some crews never even saw the planes that killed them. Just a flash, a violent impact, and then nothing. As the Superfortress pushed deeper toward enemy territory, the radar operator's voice cut through the intercom, sharp and tense. Contacts, multiple, fast, climbing. The kind of tone that made every man straighten in his seat without being told. This was no scattered interception. This was a coordinated swarm. High above, tiny black dots began to form against the sun. Japanese fighters, Zeros, Kai-43s, Kai-84s climbing hard, engines screaming as they raced to altitude. They were lighter, faster, more agile, and they were hungry, not for victory, for impact. The B-29's gunners moved into position, hands gripping cold metal, eyes locked into gun sights. They had trained for this, drilled endlessly, but training never included watching a man aim his aircraft directly at your cockpit without firing a single shot. That was something else entirely. That was terror stripped of logic. The first attack came from above and behind. Tracers ripped through the sky, bright orange lines slicing past the bomber's wings. The tail gunner opened fire, the .50 caliber guns hammering like thunder. One Japanese fighter exploded midair, breaking apart into flaming fragments that vanished into the clouds below. No cheers, no celebration. Everyone knew that for every fighter shot down, 2 more were lining up. The sky suddenly filled with chaos. Fighters attacked from every angle, head-on passes, diving slashes, climbing spirals. The B-29 shuddered as bullets punched into its fuselage. Warning lights flickered. Oxygen lines hissed. Somewhere in the aircraft, metal screamed as it tore. Still, the bomber held its course. Turning back was not an option. Not now, not this deep. Then it happened. A Japanese fighter came straight in, nose pointed directly at the right-wing route. No evasive maneuvers, no gunfire, just pure intent. The gunner fired until the barrels glowed, rounds tearing into the enemy plane, but it didn't pull away. A split second later, the fighter slammed into the wing in a violent explosion of fuel, steel, and flesh. The entire B-29 lurched sideways. Men were thrown against straps. Alarm screamed. Fire erupted along the wing. For a heartbeat, everyone thought it was over. But the wing held. Flames licked backward in the slipstream as the crew fought to contain the damage. The flight engineer shouted numbers that barely made sense anymore. Fuel pressure dropping. Control cables damaged. Still airborne, but barely. Any sane pilot would have turned back. Any sane crew would have bailed out. Before they could even process the impact, a second fighter appeared, this one aimed at the nose. Again, no gunfire, just commitment. The forward gunner fired in desperation, bullets shredding the cockpit of the attacker. The Japanese plane disintegrated meters from impact, debris smashing into the bomber like shrapnel from a bomb. The nose plexiglass cracked. Blood sprayed inside as fragments cut through the compartment. But somehow, impossibly, the B-29 was still flying. 2 ramming attacks, back to back, and the mission had barely begun. What followed was not a battle. It was an endurance test written in fire. Japanese fighters kept coming, wave after wave, attacking from blind spots from the sun, from below where the bomber's guns had limited coverage. The crew no longer counted minutes. They counted ammunition belts. They counted engine temperatures. They counted how many times they should have already died one by one. The gunners began stacking victories, not because they wanted to, but because stopping meant dying. A fighter burst into flames under concentrated fire. Another lost a wing and spiraled down, trailing smoke like a funeral banner. A third tried to ram again but clipped the tail instead. shearing off part of the stabilizer before vanishing into the void. The bomber bucked violently, controls sluggish, but still responding. Inside the aircraft, fear transformed into something colder. Focus. The kind that narrows the world into targets and triggers. Men shouted short, sharp commands. There was no room for panic. Panic wasted oxygen. By the time the fighters finally broke off, the sky behind the B-29 was littered with falling wreckage. 14 Japanese fighters destroyed. Some shot down, some torn apart mid-ram, some killed by their own desperation. The bomber was scarred, bleeding fuel, flying on borrowed time, but alive. The crew did not cheer. They did not speak much at all. They knew something important had happened up there. Something rare, something almost impossible. A single bomber, crippled and outnumbered, had survived the most fanatical aerial assault of the Pacific War. But the hardest part of the mission was still ahead. Japan lay below, and getting home would be even worse. The bomber limped forward through thinning clouds, every vibration now carrying a question mark. Was that engine still stable, or was it about to tear itself apart? The pilot kept his hands light on the controls, feeling for responses the way a doctor feels for a pulse. The right wing was damaged, scorched, its internal structure compromised, yet it still produced lift, barely enough. Any sudden maneuver would rip it away, so the B-29 flew straight, slow and stubborn, like a wounded animal refusing to lie down. Below them, the Japanese mainland grew clearer. Rivers cut through the land like dark veins. Cities lay ahead, their outlines sharp in the morning light. This visibility should have been a blessing. Instead, it made the crew feel exposed. Fighters could see them now from miles away. Anti-aircraft batteries would soon be waking up, crews running to guns, calculating altitude, speed, trajectory. The bomber was no longer just fighting planes. It was flying into a wall of steel and fire. Inside the gun turrets, the men checked their remaining ammunition. The numbers were ugly. Hours ago, the belts had felt endless. Now they were frighteningly short. Each burst had to matter. Each second of firing had to count. The gunners understood something most history books would never capture. Shooting was not about aggression anymore. It was about conservation, about surviving just long enough for the next threat. The first flak burst bloomed beneath the bomber like a black flower, violent and sudden. A second followed, closer. The explosions rocked the aircraft, fragments rattling against the fuselage like thrown gravel. One sharp crack tore through the cabin as shrapnel, punched a hole clean through the skin. Cold air rushed in, thin and brutal. Oxygen masks snapped into place. Breath became loud, mechanical, and fast. Another cluster of fighters appeared on the horizon, fewer than before, but more determined. These were not the inexperienced pilots from earlier waves. These men flew tighter formations, attacked with discipline. They probed the bomber's defenses, drawing fire, learning where the guns hesitated. One fighter slipped underneath, climbing toward the belly where blind spots lived. The lower gunner caught it at the last second, firing in a panicked, continuous stream. The Japanese plane erupted, but not before bullets stitched across the bomber's underside, tearing into systems no one could see. The engineer shouted again, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical failures cascading. Instruments dimmed, flickered, then stabilized in a sickly glow. The B-29 was becoming a flying puzzle held together by hope and airflow. Still, it pressed on. Turning back now would mean flying the same gauntlet again, wounded and slower. Forward, at least, offered the promise of completion. Another fighter made a head-on pass, closing at terrifying speed. For a fraction of a second, the crew locked eyes with the enemy pilot through the nose glass. There was no rage there, no fear, just focus. The forward guns opened up, rounds tearing through the approaching aircraft. It exploded so close that debris slammed into the bomber like a hammer blow. The nose section shook violently. A gun jammed. A man cried out, clutching his arm. Blood floating in slow arcs before being sucked toward the damaged fuselage. The crew worked around the wounded without stopping. There was no room for mercy, not even for themselves. Pain became background noise. Fear became routine. The only thing that mattered was staying airborne. Minutes stretched into something longer, heavier. The fighters began to thin out again, fuel and ammunition forcing them to break away. Below, fires burned where earlier bombers had already struck. Smoke rose in columns, twisting slowly upward, marking targets that would soon receive more destruction. The B-29 reached its bomb release point almost by accident, as if stumbling into destiny. The bombardier called the run. Doors opened beneath the aircraft. the sudden change in airflow causing another violent shudder. For a moment, it felt like the bomber might split in two. Then the bombs were gone, falling away silently, invisibly, toward the world below. The aircraft felt lighter immediately, but lighter did not mean safer. It meant faster, less stable, harder to control with damaged surfaces. As the bomb bay doors closed, the pilot began the long, careful turn away from Japan. Every degree of bank was measured. Every correction was gentle. The wounded wing groaned but did not fail. Behind them, the last Japanese fighters watched the bomber pull away, some too damaged to follow, others too low on fuel to chase. A few climbed anyway, more out of pride than strategy, firing long-range bursts that fell short. The B-29 escaped into open sky, but no one relaxed. They all knew the truth. The Pacific was vast, and rescue was rare. A forced landing at sea meant hours, maybe days. Drifting, if the aircraft even stayed together that long. The engines droned on, uneven but persistent, carrying the crew farther from the flames and closer to uncertainty. The tally was finally spoken aloud. 14 enemy fighters destroyed. The number felt unreal, almost obscene. No one aboard felt like a victor. Victory implied choice. This had been survival, nothing more. And survival, they knew, still demanded a price before the day was over hours. Passed in a strange half-life where time refused to move normally. The ocean below was endless, flat and indifferent. A steel-blue mirror that offered no comfort. Inside the bomber, the crew existed in a narrow bubble of noise and exhaustion. Every man was bruised, cut, or shaking, whether from wounds or adrenaline draining out of the body. The silence between radio calls grew heavy, broken only by the uneven rhythm of the engines and the constant whisper of rushing air through damaged seams. The pilot fought fatigue with discipline alone. His eyes burned from staring at the instruments, constantly cross-checking readings that no longer agreed with each other. One engine ran hotter than it should. Another vibrated at a frequency that felt wrong, deeply wrong, the kind of vibration that spoke of metal fatigue and impending failure. He made tiny adjustments, barely noticeable movements that kept the aircraft balanced on the edge between flight and collapse. In the rear compartment, the tail gunner stared into empty sky, finger resting lightly on the trigger. His world had narrowed to a cone of air behind the bomber. He kept expecting shapes to form, black dots rising from the horizon, but none came. The absence was unsettling. After so much violence, peace felt like a trap. He replayed the ramming attack over and over in his mind, the moment when the enemy plane refused to turn away, when death had chosen direction and speed. He wondered what kind of thoughts filled a man's head in the last second before impact. He wondered if those thoughts lingered in the air, invisible but heavy. The wounded gunner drifted in and out of consciousness. Blood had been stopped, but pain pulsed with each heartbeat, a reminder that survival was never clean. The crew spoke to him when they could. Short sentences meant to anchor him to the present. Names, places, promises of ground, of solid earth. No one said the words "if we make it." They said "when." Suddenly the aircraft lurched. A sharp jolt ran through the fuselage as one engine coughed. Backfired, then surged. The engineer's voice cut. Through the intercom, tight and controlled. Oil pressure was dropping fast. Metal particles glittered in the oil sight glass. Death signs for any engine. The decision came without debate. Feather it or lose the entire wing. The pilot nodded once. The propeller slowed, then stopped. Blades aligned with the airflow to reduce drag. The B-29 shuddered as asymmetrical thrust took hold. 3 engines now carried what 4 were meant to bear. The damaged wing protested, flexing under uneven load. The aircraft lost altitude slowly, almost politely, as if asking permission to fall. The pilot eased the nose down, trading height for speed, keeping the bomber flying by momentum and stubbornness. The crew understood the new math immediately. 3 engines meant less margin. Less margin meant every mile mattered more. The ocean below no longer felt like scenery. It felt like gravity waiting patiently. They dumped anything not essential. Spent casings, damaged equipment, even personal items were pushed out to lighten the load. A photograph fluttered away into the slipstream, a frozen smile vanishing into the vastness below. No one watched it go for long. The radio crackled with distant voices, weak but real. Friendly transmissions, Allied aircraft reporting positions. For the first time since the attack began, hope took a tangible form. They were not alone anymore. They gave their coordinates, their condition, their wounds stripped down to numbers and damage codes. Help would come, but help had limits. The bomber still had to stay in the air. Clouds rolled in, thick and layered, swallowing the horizon. Visibility dropped to nothing. The aircraft flew blind, instruments now the only truth left. Turbulence shook the bomber violently. Sudden drops followed by sharp climbs as updrafts tossed the wounded machine around like a toy. The damaged wing screamed again, metal flexing, rivets straining. The pilot kept movements minimal, coaxing the aircraft through the storm like a fragile animal afraid of loud noises. In the darkness of cloud and shadow, the crew faced their own thoughts. Fear returned, quieter but deeper. Not the sharp terror of attack, but the slow dread of waiting. Waiting for an engine to fail. Waiting for a wing to tear away. Waiting for the ocean to rise up and claim them without witnesses. Then gradually the turbulence eased. The clouds thinned. Light filtered back into the cockpit, pale and exhausted. Far ahead, barely visible at first, lay a thin line separating sky from sea. Land. Friendly land. The pilot blinked hard, unsure if his eyes were lying to him. He checked the instruments again, then again. The line remained. The crew saw it too. No cheers, no shouting. Just long exhalations they hadn't realized they were holding. They were not safe yet. Landing a damaged B-29 on 3 engines was its own kind of gamble. But it was a gamble with rules, with procedures, with runways instead of water. The bomber descended slowly, carefully, as if afraid to wake something angry beneath it. Every man braced himself for impact that might come at the runway instead of the sky. They had survived ramming attacks. They had survived 14 fighters. Now they had to survive the ground. The airfield appeared suddenly out of the haze. A narrow strip of concrete, surrounded by open ground and scattered. Structures that looked far too small to welcome. Something as wounded and heavy as a B-29. From above, it seemed calm, almost peaceful. But the pilot knew better. This would be the most dangerous maneuver of the entire mission. Bombers had survived enemy fighters only to be lost in the final minutes. When fatigue dulled reactions and damaged systems refused to cooperate, the pilot began the approach with extreme caution, lining up far out to avoid any last-second corrections. 3 engines responded unevenly, their combined thrust fluctuating as if arguing among themselves. The damaged wing dipped slightly, then steadied. The pilot countered with rudder and trim, fighting not to overcorrect. Every movement was deliberate, slow, restrained. The aircraft felt like it was being guided by pressure rather than force. Inside, the crew prepared in silence. Loose gear was secured. Wounded men were strapped in tighter. Oxygen masks were removed, then put back on, then removed again as the air thickened closer to the ground. The smell inside the bomber was a mixture of oil, burnt metal, blood, and sweat, an unmistakable scent that would cling to them long after the day ended. As the runway grew larger, the engineer called out speeds, altitudes, rates of descent. The numbers were not ideal. They were survivable. That would have to be enough. The pilot held the nose slightly high, bleeding speed without letting the aircraft sink too fast. Too slow and the bomber would stall. Too fast and the damaged landing gear might collapse. There was no perfect answer left, only least worst options. The moment the landing gear came down, the aircraft shuddered violently. A warning light flickered, then steadied. The gear was locked, at least on the indicators. No one trusted those lights completely. Not after everything else had failed today. The runway rushed up. The pilot's world narrowed to a strip of concrete and the feel of the controls beneath his hands. He eased the throttles back, one engine lagging behind the others. The bomber sank. For a heartbeat, it felt weightless, suspended between sky and earth. Then the wheels touched. The first impact was hard but controlled. The second came with a jarring slam that rattled teeth and bones. The damaged wing dipped dangerously, scraping close to the ground before the pilot corrected. Tires screamed. Brakes were applied gently at first, then harder as speed bled away. Smoke rose from the wheels, white and angry. The bomber fishtailed slightly, threatening to veer off the runway, but the pilot held it straight with sheer force of will. Finally, impossibly, the aircraft slowed to a stop. For several seconds, no one moved. The engines wound down, their uneven roar fading into silence one by one. When the last propeller stopped, the sudden quiet felt unreal, almost violent. After hours of constant noise, silence pressed in from all sides. Then the crew began to breathe again. Hands trembled, knees weakened. Some men laughed softly, the sound breaking without warning from deep inside their chests. Others sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, minds still circling the sky they had just escaped. One man wiped his face and realized his hands were covered in dried blood, someone else's, maybe his own. Ground crews ran toward the bomber, their movements urgent when they saw the damage. Burned wing sections, shattered glass, bullet holes stitched across the fuselage like scars. They stared in disbelief, counting impacts, touching the torn metal as if confirming it was real. Someone whistled low under his breath. Another shook his head slowly, unable to find words. The hatch opened. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the smell of earth and fuel and safety. One by one, the crew climbed out. Legs buckled when they touched the ground. Gravity suddenly heavier than it had been in the air. A wounded gunner was helped down carefully, every movement precise, respectful. Only then did the weight of what had happened begin to settle. 14 fighters, 2 ramming attacks, a bomber that should have fallen apart a dozen times over. The numbers were spoken again, this time by officers, by medics, by men who had not been inside that flying nightmare. Each retelling made it sound cleaner, more orderly, but the crew knew the truth. They remembered the chaos, the fear, the moments, where survival came down to fractions of seconds and instincts sharpened by terror. As medics worked and reports were taken, the crew drifted apart. Each man pulled inward by his own thoughts. Some replayed the attacks, others thought of home. Some felt nothing at all, emptiness stretching where adrenaline had once lived. The war would continue. There would be more missions. More bombers would not come back. This one had. But survival did not mean the story was finished. It only meant they had lived long enough to remember it. The debriefing room felt smaller than it should have, its walls too close, its lights too bright. The crew sat scattered across wooden chairs, flight jackets half unzipped, hands still stained with oil and blood that no one had bothered to wash off yet. Officers asked questions in calm, practiced voices, but the answers came slowly. Not because the men didn't remember, but because translating chaos into words felt impossible. How did you describe the sound a wing makes when it should have torn off but didn't? Each man told his part of the story, fragments that overlapped and contradicted each other slightly. Timelines blurred, distances stretched or shrank. What remained consistent was the feeling, the moment, when logic stopped working and survival took over. The intelligence officers wrote everything down anyway, nodding, asking for altitudes, angles, ammunition counts, 14 confirmed kills, 2 ramming attempts, severe structural damage. The numbers looked impressive on paper. The men who lived them felt hollow reading them back. Outside, mechanics swarmed the B-29 like ants around a fallen giant. Panels were removed, damage assessed. Bent spars, cracked ribs, control cables frayed almost to nothing. One mechanic ran his hand along the scarred wing and muttered that the aircraft had no business being in one piece. Another pointed out where a few inches difference would have meant total failure. The bomber was officially grounded, tagged for major repair. Some whispered that it should be scrapped entirely. Others argued it deserved to fly again. The aircraft itself said nothing, silent and still, its battle finished for now. The crew was released one by one. Some went to the infirmary. Others wandered aimlessly across the base, unsure what to do with bodies still vibrating from stress. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by dreams of engines failing and shadows, rushing head-on out of the sun. A gunner woke suddenly, heart racing, convinced he heard the scream of metal tearing again. Another stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying the instant he squeezed the trigger and watched a fighter disintegrate, wondering who had been inside it. Word of the mission spread quickly. Other air crews listened in silence as the story was told and retold. Some reacted with awe, others with disbelief, a few with quiet fear. Ramming attacks were no longer rumors now. They were confirmed, proven, personal. Pilots began scanning the sky differently after that day, watching not just for tracers, but for aircraft that didn't fire at all. Days later, the crew stood together once more, this time in clean uniforms. Commendations were read aloud. Hands were shaken. Cameras flashed. The words heroism and extraordinary gallantry were used more than once. The men accepted the praise politely, almost awkwardly. None of it matched what they remembered. Medals were light. Memory was heavy. When they finally separated, returning to their own routines, one truth followed them all. The sky would never look the same again. Blue would always carry the threat of shapes forming suddenly. Silence would always feel temporary, and every mission after would be measured against that one day when a single bomber, already marked for death, refused to fall. The B-29 sat on the edge of the airfield for weeks, patched and reinforced, its scars slowly hidden beneath new metal. From a distance, only those who had been inside it knew where it had nearly broken, where it had bent without snapping, where men had stared straight into the face of deliberate impact and survived. The war moved on, indifferent as ever. New missions were planned. New crews took off. Somewhere over the Pacific, engines droned and contrails stretched across the sky, thin white lines that vanished as quickly as they appeared. But among those who had flown that day, the memory stayed sharp and unyielding. Time did not soften the memory of that flight. If anything, it sharpened it. As days turned into weeks, the crew found that the mission followed them into ordinary moments, slipping into conversations, dreams, and silences. A simple engine sound on the ground could make heads turn. A sudden shadow crossing sunlight triggered an instinctive flinch. War had rewired them in ways no briefing could explain, teaching their bodies lessons their minds never asked for. The bomber's official combat report circulated through command channels, stripped of emotion and reduced to analysis. Diagrams showed attack vectors. Charts listed ammunition expenditure. Asterisks marked the ramming. Attempts with clinical language that failed to capture the violence of metal, meeting metal at hundreds of miles per hour. Strategists studied the report carefully. If Japanese pilots were willing to sacrifice themselves to destroy a single bomber, then air combat had entered a new phase, one where deterrence meant nothing to an enemy who had already accepted death. Other crews began altering their behavior based on the lessons learned that day. Gunners were instructed to watch not just for firing aircraft, but for silent ones. Pilots were warned that a fighter holding a straight line was often the most dangerous threat of all. The sky became a chessboard where irrational moves were suddenly the most lethal. Meanwhile, the B-29 itself became a quiet landmark on the base. Crews walked past it more slowly than usual, eyes drawn to the patched wing and reinforced sections where damage had nearly ended everything. Mechanics spoke of it with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Some said the airframe had absorbed more punishment in one mission than others did in a dozen. Others joked darkly that the plane had used up all its luck in a single day. For the men who flew it, luck was not the word that came to mind. They remembered moments too precisely for that. The instant when the ramming fighter filled the entire gun sight. The sound of the impact, that felt less like an explosion and more like being punched by the sky itself. The way the aircraft hesitated afterward, as if deciding whether to continue existing. One gunner later admitted that during the return flight, he had quietly chosen a spot in the ocean below, not because he wanted to die, but because imagining a place made the possibility easier to accept. When the engine was shut down and the plane began losing altitude, he believed, time did not soften the memory of that flight. If anything, it sharpened it. As days turned into weeks, the crew found that the mission followed them into ordinary moments, slipping into conversations, dreams, and silences. A simple engine sound on the ground could make heads turn. A sudden shadow crossing sunlight triggered an instinctive flinch. War had rewired them in ways no briefing could explain, teaching their bodies lessons their minds never asked for. The bomber's official combat report circulated through command channels, stripped of emotion and reduced to analysis. Diagrams showed attack vectors. Charts listed ammunition expenditure. Asterisks marked the ramming. Attempts with clinical language that failed to capture the violence of metal, meeting metal at hundreds of miles per hour. Strategists studied the report carefully. If Japanese pilots were willing to sacrifice themselves to destroy a single bomber, then air combat had entered a new phase, one where deterrence meant nothing to an enemy who had already accepted death. Other crews began altering their behavior based on the lessons learned that day. Gunners were instructed to watch not just for firing aircraft, but for silent ones. Pilots were warned that a fighter holding a straight line was often the most dangerous threat of all. The sky became a chessboard where irrational moves were suddenly the most lethal. Meanwhile, the B-29 itself became a quiet landmark on the base. Crews walked past it more slowly than usual, eyes drawn to the patched wing and reinforced sections where damage had nearly ended everything. Mechanics spoke of it with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Some said the airframe had absorbed more punishment in one mission than others did in a dozen. Others joked darkly that the plane had used up all its luck in a single day. For the men who flew it, luck was not the word that came to mind. They remembered moments too precisely for that. The instant when the ramming fighter filled the entire gun sight. The sound of the impact, That felt less like an explosion and more like being punched by the sky itself. The way the aircraft hesitated afterward, as if deciding whether to continue existing. One gunner later admitted that during the return flight, he had quietly chosen a spot in the ocean below, not because he wanted to die, but because imagining a place made the possibility easier to accept. When the engine was shut down and the plane began losing altitude, he believed, truly believed, that the decision had already been made. That they were just flying out the last moments granted to them. The pilot carried his own burden. Outwardly calm, inwardly relentless, he replayed every control input again and again. What if he had corrected too sharply after the first impact? What if he had delayed feathering the failing engine? The truth, that no perfect choices existed, did little to quiet the questions. Leadership in the air meant owning outcomes even when chance played the largest role. As new missions were flown, the crew noticed something unsettling. They were calmer under fire than before. Tracer rounds no longer caused spikes of panic. Flak bursts felt almost familiar. It was as if their threshold for fear had been permanently raised. This did not make them fearless, it made them quieter, more inward, more aware that survival was temporary and never guaranteed. Stories of the mission spread beyond the base. Other units referenced it casually, using it as a benchmark for endurance. If that B-29 made it back, so can we. The phrase carried encouragement, but also pressure, an unspoken expectation. That survival could be willed into existence if one simply tried hard enough. The crew knew better. They understood how thin the line truly was, how a fraction of a second, a slightly different angle, a single failed rivet, would have erased the story entirely. 14 fighters destroyed sounded impressive. What mattered more was how close the number had come to being 0 survivors instead. Sometimes, late at night, one of them would step outside and look up at the sky. Stars scattered across blackness, indifferent and ancient. Somewhere up there, countless battles had been fought and forgotten. Contrails faded. Wreckage sank. Names disappeared into records. What remained were moments, brief, violent, and intensely human, where decisions collided with fate. And among those moments, one flight stood apart. Not because it changed the war, but because it revealed what men and machines could endure when retreat was no longer an option. As the weeks passed, the mission stopped being an event and became a reference point. Every briefing after that seemed to circle back to it, directly or indirectly. Officers spoke more carefully about interception zones. Training emphasized recognizing intent rather than formation. The sky was no longer read only through instruments and doctrine, but through psychology. An enemy aircraft that ignored optimal angles, that held a straight line too long, was now treated as the most immediate threat of all. The crew felt this shift personally. On later missions, they noticed how quickly their bodies reacted before. A shadow moving the wrong way triggered gunfire almost automatically. A closing speck that refused to break off raised alarms faster than any radar call. They were no longer waiting for confirmation. Experience had burned a new rule into them. Hesitation killed. The war would eventually end, as all wars do, not with a single decisive moment, but with exhaustion settling into silence. Records would be archived. Aircraft would be scrapped or displayed. Numbers would be written into history books. Missions flown, enemy fighters destroyed, losses calculated down to the last decimal. Somewhere in those records, this B-29 would be listed as one aircraft among thousands, its mission summarized in a few restrained lines of official language. But history rarely captures what truly matters. It does not record the moment when a man realizes the aircraft coming straight at him has no intention of firing. It does not measure the weight of a second when instinct screams to look away. Yet training forces the finger to stay on the trigger. It does not describe the sound of metal tearing in a way that feels personal, almost intimate, as if the sky itself has reached out to strike you. That day, 14 Japanese fighters were destroyed. 2 chose to ram rather than retreat. Those facts are real, undeniable. But the deeper truth lies elsewhere, in the endurance of a crew who continued, flying an aircraft that had already been marked for death, in a machine that absorbed punishment beyond its design and still carried its men home. In the quiet moments afterward, when survival felt less like triumph and more like a responsibility, this was not a story about invincibility. It was a story about refusal to panic, refusal to let damage decide the outcome, refusal to surrender control, even when logic suggested there was none left. High above the Pacific, in a sky that offered no mercy and no witnesses, A single B-29 proved that survival is not always about overwhelming power. Sometimes it is about holding together, bolt by bolt, decision by decision, long enough for the storm to pass. And long after the engines fell silent and the runway lights faded behind them, that truth remained. Some aircraft returned not because they were meant to, but because the men inside them simply refused to fall. Thanks for watching.